Good afternoon. I'm Joey Wender, the Executive Director of the Shelby Coalition. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled AI in Education, the Benefits and Challenges. AI is transforming how we teach, learn, and connect, and anchor institutions are at the center of this shift. From personalized learning to ethical concerns around privacy and governance, AI brings both opportunities and challenges for schools, libraries, and health clinics. Today, we'll unpack what AI means for these anchors, the benefits we can leverage right now, and the guardrails needed to build trust and ensure access for all. To bring these ideas to life, I'm joined on this webinar by Kristen Cora, our outstanding policy counsel, along with two distinguished experts who will help us start to understand the implications of AI for anchors. Pierrette Renee Dagg, who serves as Director of Research at Merit Network, as well as professor at a number of schools in Michigan, brings an important perspective from both the research and education networks, as well as academia. And Austin Bonner, who's currently a partner at the law firm HWG, formerly served as Deputy U.S. Chief Technology Officer for Policy in the White House's Office of Science and Technology. She also, among other roles, served as a Special Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and Chief of Staff in an FCC Commissioner's Office. She brings a wealth of experience and knowledge on AI. So before we get started, just a couple logistics. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website afterwards. Audience members are muted, but we encourage you to use the Q&A box, not the chat, if you want to send us questions that we can ask the panelists. As always, please do follow us at Shelby Coalition on LinkedIn, Facebook, X, and YouTube. Also, we want to thank our corporate sponsors, Ready, Zayo, T-Mobile, Cisco, and Toronto. We would not be able to engage our work without their financial support. And so this session is also a sneak peek at AnchorNet's 2025, where AI in education will be one of the hottest topics on the agenda. As you can see from this incredible line of speakers, both of which will be coming in person to speak at AnchorNet. And so I encourage you to register today at anchornets.org. And finally, if you all enjoy and value these webinars, please consider becoming a Shelby member if you're not one already. All right, it's time to turn our attention to the issue. And so with that, I am going to hand it over to the great Kristen Cora to start the question.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Joey, and thank you to our speakers today. We are very excited to tease this topic that we are exploring at our AnchorNets conference. This was a highly requested topic from folks, so people are very interested in AI. So let's get going. We have a whole host of questions that we would love to ask our speakers today. And if you all have questions out there in the audience, please post those in the Q&A box, so that way we can try to get to your questions as well. So my first question I want to direct to both of our wonderful speakers. So today, the focus of this webinar obviously is to talk about AI as it relates to anchor institutions, particularly in education. But to really help set the stage for everybody that's listening, let's just sort of set kind of the ground rules. When we talk about AI, what are we referring to here? So Pierrette, why don't we start with you? When we talk about AI, what do we mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I could answer this from a technological perspective, and then Austin may be more appropriate to talk about it from a policy perspective. But quite simply, in terms of the technology, when we're talking about AI versus generative AI, sometimes you want to talk about both together and sometimes you want to talk about them separately. AI or tools powered by AI are things that excel at pattern recognition. And the difference, the big boom in AI that we've seen lately is a new type of generative AI, and that excels at pattern creation. So rather than just identifying patterns, we are now creating patterns based on the patterns that we've recognized.
From an application perspective, this definition is both important and pretty hard to nail down. I think about AI as any sort of technology that enables computers and machines to sort of simulate thinking like a person, reasoning, comprehending, decision making, simulating creativity. Um, these are, in some cases, really can produce spectacular results. They can also produce really mundane results. The fundamental technology behind proofreading with Apple Intelligence, like this is Apple Intelligence, but it's also spell check. And as you in the anchor community are thinking about this, it's important to realize that because there's such a broad sweep of different AI applications, there might be a broad sweep of appropriate policies or controls or governance. Those might be different too. The rules you want to apply to who's allowed to use spell check versus who's allowed to generate videos that maybe look like the head of your school district but aren't. Those might be different sets of controls. And it's important to have in your mind today that AI could be both of those things.
Excellent. And I know, Austin, we definitely want to explore that a little bit more. So we'll tee that up here in a second. So sort of to continue on this topic of, what is AI? There might be technologies that schools or other types of anchors are already using, but they may not realize that they're actually using AI. So let's throw it back to you, Pira. Is there any type of technology that schools might be using? They just don't realize it yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the challenges is a lack of transparency and understanding, not only behind the software and applications that we're using, but also how those are interoperable amongst each other. One of the biggest challenges is that when we look at everything from personalized learning to applications that help with remediation support or planning, or even software that helps you run your school or district or higher ed from an administrative level, there are so many ways that AI may be integrated into those. And right now, most studies are showing that about 80% of individuals, even at the C-suite level, cannot accurately predict or identify when they are interacting with an AI technology. In one study I did in K-12 and in higher ed, that number is actually closer to 90. And then the closer you got to the practitioner level of people who are using these applications every day, that's when most of the misunderstandings were happening. So Austin certainly can weigh in on a lot of the tools that are being used today, but I would say most likely a majority of the applications and software that we're using, especially the newer ones that are coming in, are going to leverage some sort of AI technology.
This is a really important literacy question for consumers, but also disclosure question for people who are in leadership who are introducing these technologies into an anchor community. Um, Alongside all of the data Pira referenced about how we as humans just aren't very good at knowing for sure whether we're interacting with AI, there's a strong desire amongst people to know, and they feel really strongly that it's important that they know, particularly with things like images, videos, text, like whether that was generated by AI. So people want to know for sure whether they're dealing with AI generated content and feel like they're not very good at it. So this is a place where, as you're introducing AI into an anchor community, you can really build trust the same way you build trust all the time, by being sort of forthright and direct about what you're doing and being ready to answer people's questions.
Awesome. Okay, so let's roll into some questions that I think might be on a lot of people's minds. There's a lot of concerns, maybe even ethical considerations about AI technology, use of AI in anchors, etc. So why don't we toss around some of those questions here? So Austin, let's go back to you. How is the conversation about AI different among students and parents, in the ed world from policy discussions in Washington?
I think this is such an important question. And, when I was in government and working on these issues, I'd always try to say to people, like, you policymaker need to remember that you are weird. Like, your instincts, your expectations and ideas are just not typical of most American people. And there's some good data on that now. Pew has done great research on the attitudes of American people about AI, but also the ways in which they differ from AI experts that they've defined. Um, and basically, experts are feel much more positively about AI technology than most people. And we can have a long discussion about what the reasons for that are. Um, but as we talk about these policy questions, it's important to remember that the people who are going to be on the receiving end of these services have some real concerns about what it's going to mean for their lives. They've got concerns about the erosion of people's ability to think and form relationships. They have concerns about AI getting into areas of life where they don't think it belongs. I think you might not be surprised to know that Pew's data found that people like don't think that AI should be telling people how they should understand the existence of God. That's really low on the list for uses of AI. Um, all of this is going to change over time, and as we all become more familiar and the ways in which AI is integrated to our lives becomes more obvious to us, I think a lot of this data is going to change. Um, but I think it's important that we start these conversations knowing that there are going to be a lot of people who have some really understandable skepticism, and making sure you're ready to answer their questions and make them feel comfortable in the environment of trust that you're trying to create is really important.
I would only add to that too. The other thing that we have to kind of consider is that I feel like the people that I've interacted with really just fall into two categories. Either they're not thinking about AI and their safety and their interaction at all, or they're highly concerned, as Austin kind of mentioned. And I think one of the challenges with that, or what, I don't want to say one of the reasons, but one of the potential causes is that a lot of the policy that exists does not match the reality right now. So one example is, this was during the pandemic, but we haven't done a ton to change things since then. But during the pandemic, Human Rights Watch found that 80% of the softwares that were mandated by schools for students to continue their education from home violated their human rights. And this was not just in the United States, it was in a lot of other first world countries. And the difference is, when the other first world countries had found this out, these major companies that we all use, educational providers, were fined tens of millions of dollars, but that was not the case in the US. So a lot of people I talk to that are on the awareness side or the concern side don't feel like their rights as users, human beings, and as students are in any way being protected. So that may also be one of the challenges, is there's not legal protections and legal buffers for people's individual data rights and the rights of them against this unknown surveillance from the tools.
If I could just jump in here, I mean, it seems that some of this, and I want to go back to spell check for a second with you, Austin, right? Some of this seems to center around there are really positive uses of AI, right? And that people say, well, obviously we like that, and that helps, whether we're thinking about educational outcomes or in the healthcare space, identifying diseases or other ailments, right? But then there's all these host of things that people say, ooh, to your point, that's either infringing on my ability to think. I mean, you gave the God example, right? There are other more nefarious, use cases of, the robots taking over the world, obviously, that is a huge scare. I mean, do you think a lot of it, though, is really, I guess, use specific, right? In terms of how people feel about AI, and when people are asked the question of, well, how do you feel about AI? Does it really require us to dig much lower or much deeper on, well, AI is such an umbrella abstract notion, but when you're asking about this thing, you're like, well, spell check's obviously awesome. Or AI telling me, whether God exists or not, most people will say, I don't like that. I guess if you could just delve more into that.
Well, I think you've centered on like the fundamental problem here, right? AI is a hard question to ask people about in the abstract.
Yeah.
In terms of their responses, because the applications are so different and so varied. Um, Familiarity, I think, will change attitudes with a lot of these things. But I think this is why, in policy conversations, I think we often end up talking about like sort of seizing benefits while managing risks at the same time. And the
Hmm.
benefits and risks are going to be different based on what tool we're talking about. And in each of them, you need to do that calculation. How am I going to grab those benefits and manage the risks? I think for many of us who sort of started incorporating sort of commercial AI products into our daily lives, um, it's now starting to feel more familiar, right? And I even with myself, I see myself sort of becoming a better consumer of what the outputs are. Um, but remember that this is probably a long process, right? For all of us, it's going to be a long process.
Yeah, Pierrette, do you want to add anything more?
Well, we definitely find a lot of studies show that the incidence of technophobia when it comes to AI is, for reasons that Austin gave, so much higher across the board because it is ambiguous and it's very hard to put your finger on exactly what the technology is. And a lot of it is, I believe, some of the legal protections. I think some of it is the familiarity, because how do you become familiar with something that's continually evolving? And I think another big portion of it too is for those of the percentage of the people that are concerned about it, just the transparency with data rights, data ownership.
Thank you.
So there's been some questions in the chat, and one question in particular caught my eye because I think this goes to, one of our questions that we wanted to approach today. One of our attendees asked about, there's incredibly convincing AI material out there, right? So if you have students that are using AI to create videos or other types of products, how are educators able to sort of respond? How can they differentiate between something that's created with AI or not? And I think this goes to a question about, AI introducing governance challenges, that kind of goes beyond sort of just traditional like technology management at a school or another anchor institution. So do you guys want to talk a little bit about, how does governance of AI differ from other types of approaches? Case in point, an example like this, AI generated material from students.
So I see that as two questions, Austin. I don't know if you want to hop in before me, but I heard in your question, number one, pedagogical challenge of assessment and how we teach students to use that tool ethically. And then I heard also a question about governance. So I don't know how you want to approach it, because I think we could probably answer two of those, but I see those as being a little disparate. So Austin, I'll let you answer what you care to, and then I can hop in.
Let's start with the approach to sort of student use and ethical tools, and then I think that'll lead to some governance questions. This technology is changing all the time, but I would just say there are many products that claim to be AI detectors. Um, and you should be very skeptical of their claims of how good they are. And if you ever, you've got some free time in your life, take something that you wrote, take a letter to your mom and like pop it into one of those. It's the false positive rate can be really compelling, really, really concerning. And this is important in an education setting, because if you're going to teach students to use these tools ethically and know that they're going to be part of their lives, you have to be able to have an open conversation with them. And that means not having every conversation be an adversarial conversation about like who used what tool when they weren't allowed to. Look, there are also, there are honor and integrity aspects to this, right? I'm an attorney. We practice in courts where many judges have a high expectation of transparency about their use of these tools. It's an ethical and legal responsibility in my profession. It's not wrong to start introducing students to that. I would just caution everyone about thinking that some technology is going to like take this problem off your hands, because those technologies aren't that good. Is that fair, Pierrette?
Yeah, what I would add to this too, I love that answer, is In an interview I did once, I had an educator, and this was right around when generative AI was just kind of starting to take off. And he was my one dissenter that was not telling me the sky was falling. And he said, uh, the prophecies of great social disaster are too much. He said, I'm old enough to have been in this same seat when Wikipedia came out, and you would have thought that was the end of the world. No one's ever going to do research anymore. We're not going to cite sources. People aren't going to understand how to reference and fact check, and everybody's going to become lazy. And the same prophecies of great social change they were making about Wikipedia is exactly what they're doing right now. And it's just exactly like Austin said, technology is not going to change. But if you look back through every technological revolution, we heard the same thing when we had internet in the classrooms. We heard the same thing when there were supercomputers. We heard the same thing going back to the one-way MOOCs with educational radio back in the 1920s and film right before that. We've heard this since the beginning of time with educational technology. And every single time it's been a punctuated equilibrium. And then we say, no, just like everything else, if we get into the base of the students and teach them how to use this ethically as one tool that they have for information gathering and knowledge using, they're going to use it anyway. If we don't teach them how to be responsible with it, that's when we break into some sort of a problem. And I think too, just to be a little bit out there since I can right now, perhaps too, in terms of like the teaching and assessment, we've been talking about educational reform since John Dewey. And yeah, he perhaps maybe had it right nearly 100 years ago. And this may be the inflection we need to actually look at our assessments and the way that we are guiding and teaching and learning, and actually think about maybe adopting some of those principles.
So maybe sticking with this, because I know we've got another question that came in the chat about, okay, if no, if money were no object, what kind of programs, what kind of ways can our educators and families and students use technologies in a safe way? Why don't we try to tackle that question? What are some steps maybe that anchor institutions, educators can take to try to maybe evaluate the AI tools they already use, or new ones that are emerging? Are there some practical steps here that you would give to educators or anchors or a community, right?
I think, oh yeah, you go ahead, Austin.
I think a good place to start is by doing a little bit of risk mapping. What are you worried about? And that list, you don't need to self-edit. Like, put everything down that you're worried about, because we don't manage risk in the abstract, right? We identify risks and then we manage them. Some of the things you might be worried about in the school community are misinformation, for example. Students thinking that videos represent news of the real world, and they aren't. There's good training on media literacy out there that is not all AI specific, but are things that we really can be taught about how we evaluate the credibility of sources, how we evaluate bias. And some of it has some real AI specific applications. You start learning quickly to zoom in. I love internet dog videos. I love them. I'll watch so many of them. And they're so fake now. And the dogs, they all have 8 toes. And if you zoom in at all, like, they're kind of janky. They don't look like real dogs. And like, it does, obviously, this is not a big deal in the dog video world. But it is a way for us to help learn to zoom in on pictures of the president. And if he has 6 fingers on one hand, that might not really be the president. There are good programs out there. That's just one example of like how you might start thinking about managing a risk. A risk I worry about all the time as an attorney and somebody who cares a lot about the development of younger attorneys is, how are we going to manage the risk of just people doing bad work, right? Like, of just getting not that great first drafts and not doing a very good job punching them up. And that's something that can be managed with a different kind of training, including some training about thinking about when are times when even if AI might seem like it helps me, I just shouldn't use it because the value of my learning is higher than the value of the time saved. Um, but start with risk. Start with what you're worried about, and then we can talk about managing them.
And Austin, if we're thinking about the healthcare context, right? Because we're also not just speaking about libraries and schools, but also health clinics. Would the advice be the same thing? Like start with risk management, whether it was using AI results in a misdiagnosis or using AI, doctors, to your point, I mean, following up on your exact point, doctors don't try as hard or just, assume that whatever the AI tool gives them back is the right answer. I mean, is that the same type of analysis you'd use in the healthcare context with respect to AI?
I would say I would add two glosses to the healthcare context. One is just we're in that context, maybe a little more akin to the lawyer world. We're talking about a place that like how you manage risk is in some ways governed by law, right? And so there is a set of obligations that might be above and beyond just the baseline of risk management, and being attentive to those is really important. Um, the the other thing I would say is that there you've got risks that are really different in their magnitude, and so might require different kind of interventions. If one of a law student who I'm working with produces a bad paper, that's bad for a bad educational outcome and something I want to work with them on, but is a fundamentally different question than a surgical error, right? So my expectation is that our colleagues from healthcare related anchors on the phone have a lot of experience with that kind of really big downside risk management. So maybe similar in kind, but with a different character.
Super helpful.
And let's
All
take
right.
step back too. So we're talking a lot about the generative AI, but remember that AI encompasses programs and softwares outside of generative AI too. So we're using this as uh, you know pathways to learning or individualized learning. We're using it to help remediate students who have challenges with different abilities and help them learn in other ways. We're using this for administrative capabilities, right? So there are all these other applications. And my question for some of these things, if we're talking about risk mitigation, would you get on a plane that was run by an AI that had no manual and no accountability if it failed? Because that's exactly what we're asking our educators and our students to do right now. So I think one of the challenges is, and I'm pro AI, I'm an AI ethicist by trade and publication, so I'm not anti AI at all. But we have to really understand some of these risks. So number one, particularly with these educational tools that are coming out, a very large number of AI generated or AI powered learning modules are not designed by educators. And they also haven't been around long enough to actually understand if it's strong pedagogy, if the educational learning outcomes are what we actually think they are. Just to give you an example, a Sesame Street example. One of the reasons why they were such a breakthrough show when they came out is because they would take every single skit that they were going to air on television and they would show this to children, and then they had periods of assessment. So at a 1 hour mark, a 1 day mark, a 1 month mark, a 3 month mark, could these children still remember the lessons that Sesame Street were trying to teach it? And the segments that did that made it through the show. The sections that didn't did not. And up until Blue's Clues, there's actually not been another pedagogical assessment of children's television or children's programming since then. And that's what made Sesame Street so different. Now put that in context of we have educators at every level who have been learning the best way to teach students since the first schools, which are pre-Revolutionary War in America, right? So we understand how to create good learning outcomes from the ways that we teach. All of a sudden there's a new technology. This has not been tested. Now we're having these things designed by people who have little to no educational experience in many cases. So I think that that's a huge risk and a huge problem. So when we are implementing these things in an educational outcome, we need to be very sure that we have measurements and metrics in place that we are getting the desired outcome. I think everything we do with these programs, whether it's for administration or for teaching, we need to have accountability and transparency metrics in place. If we're using this to do things like flag remediation plans or identify risks of dropout or something like that, it needs to be reproducible across the board. And I don't think we always see that. Also putting on my tinfoil hat again, because that's kind of what I do. Some of it, I think there's absolute positives, but there are absolute concerns when you start to see the enmeshment of corporations and capitalism in education to a larger degree than we already have seen, which is absolutely what's happening now. So I would say too, we need to make sure that we are putting measurements or evaluations in place to ensure that whatever the students are interacting with do not produce any kind of behavioral manipulation unless that is psychologically backed by science for positive good. We need to be concerned about coercion, and we also need to be concerned about the introduction of addictive behaviors, because that can also be a thing that happens that's introduced at a school level and then taken home.
Thank you so much. Wow. Okay. I want to roll into.
Oh wait, Austin looked like she had a counter to that.
Oh no, not a counter. I noted that we had a question in the chat about parents as stakeholders, and I thought your comment was the perfect lead-in to say that, like so many technologies, these are going to get taken home. And it's important that as much as we're educating the students who'll be using them about what they're using, that parents really be able to understand, what's on that Chromebook that's coming into their house so that they can apply, they can be both in the role of somebody who wants to be supportive of education and also be another set of eyes on, what's going on there, making sure it's appropriate.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. Yes, I wanted to make sure we got to that question as well. So thank you. So one question I want to make sure we ask, because here at Shelby, we concern ourselves with anchor institutions, specifically around broadband and connectivity needs. So Austin, I have a question for you. How will AI change connectivity needs? What can anchors do to make sure their networks are ready?
The studies that I have seen suggest that we're moving into a world where we're going to be focused a lot more on uploads than we've ever been before. So the current state of the internet, a lot of it is driven by video streaming and download, right? So that's a lot coming from the pipe to the person. But many of these AI technologies, particularly those that can look at images and then respond with text information, for example, kind of flip that script. I don't imagine, now the split is really dramatic. It is something in the like 90%, 90-10 download upload. That may not go anywhere close to parity, but it is going to change, and that matters for how our networks are managed and created. It matters for what wireless spectrum we use. And it matters for sort of where and how students and others may be connecting. This is, I think, actually an incredibly important question for the healthcare community. If you've got people who are using assistive devices that need to constantly be sending audio and images for processing to provide the assistance, your in-house network is going to have to change to support that. So as you introduce the devices, it's just really, I think, important to be in touch with your tech stack about what you're doing. And some of the stuff is so cool. I listened to a really fascinating interview with a person with very low vision who was talking about using AI glasses and the way it had really changed his life to be able to approach an elevator bank. And his vision was strong enough that he would know he's at an elevator bank, but not be able to read any of the buttons. And to be able to independently not ask someone standing there and not have to use other kinds of interventions to independently just get where he's going and like not have that blip in his day really is life-changing. But in some of our communities where broadband may already be hard to come by, it puts even more pressure on us to make sure that we're not forgetting that there's still a digital divide in this country that still needs our attention.
And to yes, and that, the only other thing that I would add is not only do we need to make sure the digital divide is not there because it's becoming increasingly important, when we look at the technology itself, there's a thing called early adopter iteration bias. And so if you basically want to think about training data and algorithmic bias, if we have programs, prescribed learning content, educational tools, whatever it might be, the more training data something gets, i.e. interactions, the more it learns from and skews towards that. So if we have white or affluent or city dwelling people who are using, students that are using these programs more and more and more, just like everything else, just like standardized testing or anything else we're going to use, it is going to drift further and further and further away from our rural communities, from the less affluent communities, people who have less connectivity, people who have fewer devices at home. So essentially what we're doing is not only is it more important just for the connectivity and the access in general, but we are also, every time we use this and don't include everybody, increasing exponentially the digital divide just via the way algorithms fundamentally work.
Well, so we've got just a little bit of time left, so maybe we just do sort of a wrap up, like a final, question for both of you. Just sort of lessons learned. What's sort of a final takeaway that those on this call can leave with? I know we talked about, sort of evaluating your risks, having honest conversations. Is there any other, tips or advice, that our educators, our families, those in anchor institutions should really be thinking about as they approach the future of AI technology? Austin, should we start with you?
Well, I would say for, the anchor institution leaders on the call, if your institution has not adopted a policy about AI use inside your institution, it's time to do that. Because if you don't have a policy, you probably, the studies show, probably have some folks who are using AI that you don't know about. And that's something that you're going to want to have a handle on from the perspective of data control, from particularly where you've got obligations about medical data or student data. These don't have to be a huge lift. It is really a pretty basic risk management exercise, but it's really, really important not to let it go, not to let it go too long, because these tools, they're just popping up in places where, for example, if you subscribe to some basic tools like even the Google Office suite, it's very easy for your teams to click out and think, oh, I'm in Gemini now, and this must be part of my package. This must be something that's part of our team. And maybe that's what you want. But if it's not what you want, it's time to start talking to your teams. I see a question here about sample policies, just popped up in the chat. I'll just say, maybe this is something that Joey and I can talk about, like what would be good to recommend, because there's a really wide variety out there for your different situations. But we'll work on that and see what we can come up with.
The only thing that I would add is more of a philosophical question for us all to consider. I think I'm absolutely pro use of the technology, but when we use it, we also need to think about the implications for ourselves, for our institutions, for our students, for our users, for our library patrons. As we use the technology, endorse, teach, and apply it, be careful what we're saying and teaching all of our civic body about surveillance and the acceptance of surveillance versus the scrutiny of surveillance, because right now that is just the norm. It is just, we are teaching our students that surveillance and that kind of a state is just how things are, right? So be careful about that. And then also, the more that we're seeing this enmeshed in the classroom, I think we need to be careful about what we're teaching about deliberation, people's comfort with deliberation, and then also the implications on what that means for dissent. I think all of those three things, if we're looking future state at raising the next society, those are all contributors to potential threats to democracy that is our responsibility to think about when we're using these tools within our institution.
Well, I wish we could keep going. And fortunately, we can. You should come to AnchorNet. Both of these incredible speakers will be there. I thought this conversation was extremely rich, but also just scratched the surface. There's so much more there. I learned a lot today. I bet Kristen C. also learned a lot as well. So I'm really looking forward to the AI workshop during AnchorNet. And so we're coming to the end here of the webinar. We first want to thank our terrific speakers and also want to thank again our sponsors, Ready, Zayo, T-Mobile, Tarana, and Cisco. And just a reminder, if you've enjoyed these webinars, please consider becoming a Shelby member today. It's very easy to sign up. And we would close here with, again, reminding everyone on this webinar to attend AnchorNet. At the end of October here in DC, it's a conference where broadband policy meets real world action. AI will be one of the topics we discuss in depth at this year's conference. So I encourage you to register today at anchornet.org. We hope to see all of you in person in Crystal City in October. And so this comes to the end. Thank you again for attending this webinar.